Hello again, I am Blunty, and for those of you who've joined me from the two previous videos exploring this brand new Olympus pen, welcome back. Today we're at last digging into the thing that matters most about a camera, the end result. A quick reminder for the folks just jumping on board, those who perhaps didn't care to watch the hardware video and only wanted to see what the camera can actually do. This review unit I had is a pre-production sample. It wasn't loaded with final firmware either, so some things are subject to refinement and tweaking by the time it actually hits shelves and your eager hands. Now, that out of the way, how about those stills? Well, it fell right in line with my expectations for it. Expectations I had constructed based on it being loaded up with the same image sensor and same image processor that the OMD EM5 introduced us to, and which I was impressed by last year when I reviewed that very camera. So, on the one hand, it held no great surprises for me, which admittedly chipped some of the excitement of the new toy buzz off it. But on the other hand, it was like meeting an old friend who always brings a nice bottle of scotch over when they visit. Very pleasant and very welcome indeed. The EM5 is placed as the premium pen camera, and the performance fell in line with that reckoning. The clarity of the images was, in a word, lovely. The dynamic range was welcoming, but unfortunately, being a camera that didn't officially exist when I was actually testing it, my editing software didn't natively support the RAW files it produced, so I was restricted to working with the out-of-camera JPEGs only, which, it has to be said, under some conditions were slightly too aggressively processed. So, while I was almost always pleased with what the camera produced in its JPEGs, I know for a fact, again thanks to my time with the OMD EM5, that there's more detail, more dynamic range, and even cleaner, smoother tones to be wrung out of this sensor and image processor than the JPEGs were showing me. For example, the keen-eyed will spot occasionally nasty JPEG compression artifacts in places like the gently tonal clear blue sky. But aside from that, even stuck in JPEG town, I was very impressed by the stills. The colours are wonderful. They've, of course, got that typical Olympus richness and pop to them, which Ollie favouring shooters will always love. And some images I got out of it even verge on expressing that kind of ineffable liquidity that Fuji fanboys love from the X-series cameras. The tones and contrast are all very pleasant indeed, and there's plenty of detail resolved. Most of these shots were from the 17mm kit lens, and a few more were from the Olympus 12mm and 45mm lenses, which I chose specifically for their superb resolution to give the sensor the best information to work with possible. In low light, things once more were keenly reminiscent of my time with the OMD. The wide dynamic range really comes into play here too, keeping lots of crisp details in the shadows without nuking the highs, and the tone roll-off was usually smooth and natural looking too, very pleasant. And it's here in low light where that tweaked 5-axis image stabilization system really cuts a big smile across one's dial too. All those light traily pics I'm showing you, yeah, all done handheld, no worries at all. Got most of them first try as well. It makes it so easy. Admittedly, they would have been sharper if I'd been a good little snapper and used a tripod, but fact is, the stabilization is so gobsmackingly good you can get away with the near incredible done handheld if you really need to. I also really enjoyed using the EP5 as an inoffensive street shooter between the small size, the subtle, classy design, the quiet shutter, blisteringly fast autofocus and tilting touchscreen operation. You can either be an unnoticed ninja collecting the world as it is, unfettered by interference of your presence, or bring yourself right into the subject's world without an ounce of gear-related intimidation that big chunky DSLRs may inspire in the victim at hand when you thrust a camera into their face. Plus, pulled down to monotone, the images coming out of it look pretty damn fantastic if I do say so myself. They're almost fluid in their tonality. And again, these are all just processed from the JPEG, so just imagine the extra wiggle room the RAW files will give you. The 9 frames per second continuous shooting works rather nicely too, though the buffer is a bit small, so you'll only get about a second or so before it starts slowing down to save out the buffer files to your SD card. But it will be sufficient for helping you snatch up the definitive instant from a fleeting moment. And now to polish off, let's look at what the new extended range of ISO speeds means in the real world. As we talked about in the hardware video, if you saw it, the new bottom-end ISO 100 setting isn't actually a true ISO 100. It's a so-called low mode, done with in-camera trickery from the native low point of the sensor, which is ISO 200. So, To get an ISO 100 equivalent sensitivity, you do technically sacrifice just a bit of dynamic range. But in the real world, you know what? It's barely detectable under most conditions. In this test, for example, it's just expressed as a slight loss of detail in the highlights, and the shadows remain all but untouched actually, so that's fine by me. As we jump up through the range of ISO settings, nothing much changes. There's a slight increase in very fine-grained noise that only the most anal of pixel peoples will even notice in everyday use, and by the time we get to ISO 2500, things are still looking pretty clean. ISO 6400 starts presenting some more noticeable shadow noise, and the highlights start rolling off a bit more abruptly, but on the whole, still very usable. ISO 12800 is getting to the point where most serious shooters would be concerned, but it's still remarkably well controlled. I'd not print from these perhaps, but for web use, I'd use it if I needed it. And by the time you hit the expanded level of ISO 25600 though, things get they get a bit ugly. There's a big drop in dynamic range, and the noise itself takes on a very unpleasant, harsh digital look. Not good for anything serious even remotely, but it is handy to have it sitting there for low light snapshots where you can't or don't want to use the flash. Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it, I guess. So there you go, in stills mode it's a damn fine camera, which again I wasn't shocked to discover given the heritage and reputation its guts have already built sitting inside the OMD EM5, but good to confirm nothing's been screwed up or crippled anyway. If you'd like to take a look at these images without whatever YouTube managed to do to them, there is a Google Plus gallery link in the video description, as there usually is in my camera reviews. Next video up, we're taking a squiz at the video performance, which is a slightly more mixed bag, I'll tell you that right now, so it'll be interesting. After that, I'll take the EP5 head-to-head shot for shot against the camera it replaces the EP3, just to see how far ahead it's managed to jump. But for now, thanks for watching I Am Blunty, and I will catch you next time.